Welcome to Lost Ladies of Lit, the podcast dedicated to forgotten women writers. I'm Kim Askew, here with my co-host and writing partner, Amy Helms.
The lost lady we're discussing today, Mary Wollstonecraft, is known to some as the mother who tragically died giving birth to future Frankenstein author Mary Shelley. Today, some consider Wollstonecraft the mother of feminism, though we should note the concept didn't really exist in her day.
Right. She used a framework of philosophical arguments to champion women's rights and was privately referred to by the writer Horace Walpole as a, quote, hyena in petticoats.
Is that like some 18th century equivalent of nasty woman?
I think so, yeah. Wollstonecraft's 1792 A Vindication of the Rights of Woman was a feminist declaration of independence. She argued that women, despite being rational beings with minds equal to men, were kept powerless by a system that denied them an education and treated them as sexual commodities.
Wollstonecraft's words were revolutionary. Sadly, her husband's sincere endeavor to preserve her legacy following her death ended up having the opposite effect on how she was remembered. Her work moldered in obscurity for almost a century before modern feminists took a renewed interest in her.
If, like Amy and I, you've heard of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman but have never actually taken the time to sit down and read it, you're in for a treat today. We've got a special guest with a new book out on Wollstonecraft's seminal work, and she's going to take us through the author's fascinating life as well as some of her key arguments in her Vindication.
And since we're still fighting this fight, it only makes sense that we should take a closer look at Wollstonecraft's ideas. So let's raid the stacks and get started.
Our guest today, Dr. Susan J. Wolfson, is a professor of English at Princeton University. Her scholarship focuses on British writers of the Romantic period. She has written and edited numerous books, including a 2022 compilation of Keats's poetry called A Greeting of the Spirit, and 2018's Romantic Shades and Shadows, as well as annotated editions of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. So cool.
A Guggenheim and NEH recipient, her most recent title is called On Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in April by Columbia University Press. Susan, congratulations on the book and welcome to the show.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, so Wollstonecraft was born in 1759, and Susan, the first words in the first chapter of your book are, "She was destined for this." Do you want to elaborate on how her upbringing and her background set the stage for what would come?
Well, it wasn't just Wollstonecraft's family horror show, but this is rather typical. Women had no power in the family. She had a weak, uneducated mother. The education budget went entirely to the first son. The rest of the children were not educated. The father was a spendthrift. He was a drinker. He beat her mother. He beat the children when he could. She slept outside her mother's bedroom in order to protect her. And as soon as she could, she devised ways to get out of that family horror show altogether. She made friends with neighbors, with a clergyman, and became kind of self-educated with those resources. She knew early on from the example of her parents and a lot of what she saw that marriage wasn't for her. It wasn't just marriage to a husband who could do what he liked with her body, beat it, rape it, or whatever else, but it was also the serial pregnancies that came with marriage and were eventually a death sentence. If not in your first or second pregnancy, which is what took her mother out, your 14th or 15th pregnancy. And yet the opportunities for women who did not want to marry were really quite scant. So what's a brainy woman like Wollstonecraft going to do? She tells herself and she tells her sister, my nature is pulling me in a different direction, off the beaten track, and I've got to figure out how to make this work. She was, fairly young when she made that decision. So she was already sensing that the social structure that governed women's lives was not something that she could embrace, and she wanted alternatives. So that's her being born for this. Meanwhile, the French Revolution happened, and a form of government that people thought, was baked into human history, monarchy, suddenly got overturned. And a new republican form of government based on participation. The famous motto was liberty, fraternity, and equality. That was the French Revolution. The American Revolution had already happened. It seemed that revolution in social structures was not only possible, but inevitable. I mean, this was the coming political order. And Wollstonecraft was excited about that. She was a strong supporter of the principles of the French Revolution. However, women were excluded from the French Revolution. So Wollstonecraft felt that the unfinished work of the French Revolution was the rights of women.
So it's clear that she's looking around as a young woman and saying, I don't like what I'm seeing. We got to fix this.
I mean, that's the poignancy. There wasn't a feminist community or even a community of women who were thinking the same way. They were few and far between.
And so I think it's kind of fascinating that in 1783, she actually sets up an all girls school.
Yes, she did. I mean, she wanted girls to have an education that stressed their brains, not their bodies. She wanted to introduce science, history, botany, physical exercise, subjects, of wider concern than preparing for the marriage market. It didn't work out. It turned out there wasn't that much of a market for that kind of education for women, and she was not an experienced businesswoman. So when she had to leave the school to go help out her dear friend Fanny Blood, who died from her pregnancy in Portugal, when she came back, the school was pretty much in a shambles. And to, raise her spirits and raise some money to pay off the debts that the school owed, she wrote her first book, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. So she's doing teaching by another means. She's discovered that you can teach through publication, through writing.
So, when the school floundered financially, she ended up taking a governess position with a wealthy Irish family. And it was a twist of fate she equated with being sent to prison. Was there any upside for her in taking this job?
Yes. And of course, Wollstonecraft has a real knack for turning dead ends into new pathways. And this is one of the first adventures. Through friends in London who were impressed with her, she got employment at £40 a year with the wealthy Kingsboroughs. Now, £40 a year, I mean, this was serious change. But it entailed really going far away. Wollstonecraft had lived in London her whole life. This was going to take her to Cork, 140 miles southwest of Dublin. And she said when she entered the household, she felt like she was going into a Bastille, the French prison. But it turned out that this Bastille had a pretty decent library. So at night, Wollstonecraft read a lot. She also liked the daughters that she was hired to educate, particularly the oldest daughter, Margaret, who became very attached to her. And Margaret herself had a very interesting life afterwards. She became a doctor. But Wollstonecraft took these girls outside. She educated them by showing them nature. She read with them. She challenged them intellectually. Meanwhile, Lady K, as she called her, was a kind of bimbo out of the world of Jane Austen's novels. Very wealthy, very vain, spent a lot of time dressing for dinner, taking baths of milk and rose water. Wollstonecraft's letters of her are quite sarcastic. And entire paragraphs could be exported to Jane Austen's novels, Lady Bertram, and those sort of wealthy aristocrats. And then Lady K fired Wollstonecraft. So she had, just her salary, no prospects, no letter of recommendation, no plans. And she goes back to London and meets with Joseph Johnson, who had published a book that she had written while she was in Ireland, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. So he knew her and he thought she was really smart, that she wrote clearly, she wrote logically, she was lively, and he was a mensch. He just said, I'll help you out. He set her up in rooms above his bookshop and then helped get her established in her own apartment. He gave her employment. He decided to publish her next novel called Mary. Then he soon hired her at this new sort of progressive journal, something like the New Yorker or something like that of the day, called the Analytical Review. And Wollstonecraft worked there as a translator and as a reviewer. And that became a kind of second education for her. She got to read a lot of stuff, and a lot of stuff that women usually don't get to read. But since the reviews were anonymous, she could write about boxing, politics, history, and science, as well as a shelf load of novels that really just disgusted her as being kind of junk literature. She's really funny in writing about them, but you can tell she's just exhausted with the sort of recycled plots and character types over and over again. But she wrote a ton for him. Johnson had a kind of virtual college. He had these weekly dinners in his rooms above the bookshop. And the bookshop itself was a kind of de facto library. Anybody could come in there and read the books. But at this table, there was William Godwin and William Blake and Joseph Priestley and Joel Barlow, Anna Barbeau, and Mary Wollstonecraft.
Dream job.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was a genuinely intellectual circle. I mean, Virginia Woolf writes a wonderful essay about this, where Virginia Woolf, excluded from Oxford, had great sympathy for Mary Wollstonecraft's enthusiasm for this. She said, she was an honorary young man, basically. She was just called Wollstonecraft. There wasn't any sort of polite differential of manners or things they couldn't talk about. So this just completely jazzed her, that she had a real intellectual life at last in London.
Yeah, this Joseph Johnson guy who would wind up publishing so much of
all of her
her.
stuff.
I mean, he comes across as a really great guy.
Yeah, he is. And he published a lot of out there writers. I mean, he was somebody who took risks with writers that he believed in and, was a real force in the London publishing world.
I wanted to touch really quick again on thoughts on the education of daughters, because in a previous episode, Kim and I had discovered, I think his name's John Fordyce?
James Fordyce, yeah.
James Fordyce, yes, he wrote that very condescending book about how to educate your daughters.
Extremely popular.
Yes. And so this book that she wrote is kind of almost like an answer back to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters is very cautious. She's not yet Mary Wollstonecraft.
Okay.
I mean, the real reply to Fordyce comes in the middle chapters of The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, where she takes his conduct manual, Dr. John Gregory's conduct manual, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's conduct manual for women called Sophie, the chapter of Emile. And she basically opens the book and says, here's what they say, here's what's wrong with what they say. In other words, she's teaching us how to read against the grain of the three most prestigious books that have been given to parents on how to educate their daughters. Thoughts on the Education of Daughters is just her kind of putting her toe in the water. Once she becomes Mary Wollstonecraft, she's a famous person by the time she's writing A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Then she lets it all rip open.
Okay.
All right.
Love it.
Now, you might remember that the Reverend Fordyce, James Fordyce, is set up for parody even by Jane Austen.
Yeah, exactly. In Pride and Prejudice.
Mr. Collins pulls it off the shelf, and all the girls in the household just titter and roll their eyes.
Such a hilarious scene.
Yeah.
And the women at the time were doing that.
Yeah.
Like, oh, this guy. Yeah.
Well, yeah, Austen is writing this in the late 90s. Pride and Prejudice gets published in 1813, but yet it was already a kind of ironized discourse, but they still had to do it. I mean, the middle-class women who wanted to marry well pretty much had to shape themselves into marriageable young women. Don't be smart, be deferential. If you have any learning, hide it. If you have any physical vigor, don't show it because it's considered indelicate. These were still the codes. And for most women, securing a good marriage with what you had was the life goal. And you had to make all those decisions in your 20s. By 28, you were a spinster and your shelf life on the marriage market was toast.
All right, well, that's a perfect segue talking about marriage. So, Wollstonecraft turned down a marriage proposal. She had a very memorable reply, though. Can you tell us about that and also her views on marriage? Why did she see it as such an unappealing prospect? We can kind of guess, but.
I mean, the idea that you marry for love is a very late, romantic notion that happens mostly in novels, which is why Wollstonecraft is so cautious about novels because it gives false expectations. It was an economic arrangement. Could you find the kindest and most provident man and then prostitute your body to that person? That's what she saw. Some women, wound up lucky and happily married, but most really just made that kind of settlement. Charlotte Lucas, in Pride and Prejudice, for instance, the spinster who takes the odious Mr. Collins on the rebound, makes a rational judgment. He's a bit of a clod, but this is the best that's going to come her way.
Yeah, she knows exactly what she's getting into.
She knows exactly what she's getting into, and she figures out how to make the best accommodation with it. So, marriage is a very, very severe compromise, especially for an intellectually lively woman like Wollstonecraft. Her husband could prohibit her from writing if he wanted to, as a dereliction of her domestic duties. He certainly had entire claim on any income she made from her writing, even claim on her manuscripts. So she gets this proposal from an intermediary, someone who had noticed her and thought she was pretty hot. And she was. She was a really good looking woman. She was physically vigorous. She was smart. She was lively. And she refused it by proxy. And then the guy tried again, and she was insulted. She said, I won't submit myself to prostitution just because I've fallen on financial hard times. And it was the first time that she used the word prostitution for marriage, legal prostitution. Now, she did fall deeply in love with a really bad husband prospect, Gilbert Imlay, in France, and had a daughter with him, but he just wasn't husband material, and he broke her heart. Almost broke her body. She tried to commit suicide twice out of despair of his, ever loving her and wanting to set up a home with her. She finally met William Godwin again. A mutual friend reintroduced them, and they began an affair within months. They would not get married. That was something they didn't want to do because of the legal constraints on marriage for a woman. But when she got pregnant again with little Mary, they put aside principle and got married. And it cost Wollstonecraft a lot because people hadn't realized that she wasn't married to Gilbert Imlay. She had been calling herself Mrs. Imlay. She had a daughter, little Fanny Imlay. And when she signed herself Mary Wollstonecraft Spinster in the church register, it was obvious that she had not been married and that Fanny was illegitimate and that she had had an affair out of wedlock. And a lot of their friends cut her, basically refused to see her. She was heartbroken by that, but her other friends stayed true.
So it really, in some ways, there's no winning.
Yeah.
You talk about all the bonds of marriage and how it would chain her, but not marrying also cost her, so.
Yeah, it did, but she was really happy with Godwin. I mean, that was a really good marriage. Finally, it was her last great adventure. It was somebody who loved her mind, who loved her courage, who admired her vindications, and expected to have a life with her. They had separate sort of apartments for working, and then they got together in the evening for dinner and sex. So they kind of figured out, how to have a marriage that would work for both of them, where they would have intellectual independence and they would both be professional writers and they would have a marriage. And he adored her first daughter, little Fanny. Everybody expected that this was going to work out.
It sounds like a very modern marriage by today's standards, right? Like they would fit in well today. All right, so let's talk about her vindications now. Let's switch gears. You mentioned the French Revolution earlier. This really galvanized Wollstonecraft. So tell us about this first work, A Vindication of the Rights of Men, and the importance of that.
So Edmund Burke turns out to be the father of both her vindications in some ways. Edmund Burke was a liberal Whig parliamentarian. He sided with the American Revolution, basically on the issue of taxation without representation. He was against the corruption of the colonial administration in India. He was for the abolition of slavery. In other words, she wasn't dealing with a right wing troglodyte. So Edmund Burke, however, saw the French Revolution, said, "This is not good. The monarchy is a divinely sanctioned institution. Even though there are inequalities, it is the pattern of nature. Nature is not uniform. Some trees grow big, some don't. And those who are talking about equality are really destroying the world." He writes about the French monarchy as if it were divinity on earth. And Burke really knew how to rock a sentence. I mean, it became an instantaneous bestseller. Wollstonecraft was reviewing for the Analytical Review at the time. And so she thinks that she wants to review Burke for the Analytical Review. And it was quite clear, even though the Analytical Review could sponsor a dozen pages for a review, she said, "No, I can't do it." And she decided she had to just sit down and write this out. She wrote it in a blaze in about a month. It was the first response to Burke. There were several responses to Burke. This was the first one that came out. It was called A Vindication of the Rights of Man. The Rights of Man being the French revolutionary document. And this wasn't just thoughts on or reflections on or letters on the rights of man. She goes out for an aggressive genre, a vindication. That means literally to speak with force. It means that you're going to make a real powerful argument. So this comes out and it's noticed. It sells out. The first edition sells out. Her name is not on the title page. The second edition comes out about 3 or 4 weeks later, and it's got by Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, that's really unusual for a woman to sign her name. It's considered extremely unfeminine to go public that way. But it's a very short pamphlet, very powerful, very funny, very sarcastic.
I love that it wasn't even like a preconceived thing for her. She was just so fired up, you
Yes.
know? It's just like she had no plans to write something like this until she was galled by it, basically. Yeah.
So Burke became the sort of accidental muse. And then in arguing with Burke, she also kind of started writing paragraphs that she realized had the argument of the vindication of the rights of woman. When she started talking about equality, she realized that women were involved in that there was a social system that created inequality in which ideally citizens would be fellow citizens and be equals. And I think as she was writing that, the idea of a vindication of the rights of woman was beginning to take shape, because as soon as she finished that, I mean, this was out in, the second edition in December 1790. By January of 1791, she was already kind of, planning out a vindication of the rights of woman. And she was speaking to the political left. If you are for the rights of man, you have to be for the rights of woman. You can't have it both ways.
I'm sure there were other women that were maybe writing or at least discussing fairness and equality for women. What is it about this work that made it so persuasive and made it such a sensation right off the bat?
Well, there were other women who were writing, but they were accommodating themselves to the world in which they had to make a living. So you don't find, except obliquely, what we would recognize as kind of feminist argument in the works of Frances Burney or Maria Edgeworth, or even Anna Barbeau, who distressed Wollstonecraft with some of her poems about female delicacy. So Wollstonecraft got very interested in the linguistic politics of vindicating the rights of woman. And she takes that on right away at the beginning. She has a real attack on comparing women to flowers. She said that's just admiring them for their beauty and delicacy and short lived value. You're toast at the end of the day, and it can only be a barren blooming. She takes on the stigma of being called a masculine woman. That would be the version of a nasty woman. And she has this really funny satire. She says, well, if by that you mean that a masculine woman is somebody who's into hunting and gaming and swearing and cursing and drinking, I'm with you. Who wants to be a masculine woman? And then she says, if you mean by masculine power of intellect, moral self accountability, the practice of civic virtue, may they every day grow more and more masculine. And one of the most stunning passages in The Rights of Woman is when she says about Catherine Macaulay, who had just died. She said, I will not call hers a masculine understanding because I do not want to give men that arrogation of the adjective. She is forceful and strong, and there is no sex to that.
Wow.
Right on, girl.
Yep. Preach.
So she's amazingly detached the descriptors, masculine and feminine, from biological destiny and read them in what we would, kind of call, critical gender theory, seeing it as a part of a political system of value and not inherent in any one particular accident of birth.
And she does it all in such an entertaining way. It's like, her style of writing, she's laying out rhetorical gems that are almost irrefutable, really. But then at the same time, she has this kind of tone that I love where she's just like, oh, I don't know, riddle me this. Where you just kind of like her personality as she's laying it all out.
She is funny. I mean, I'm glad you like that because some people find her boring to read, but I don't think, you don't want to read this all in one night. But with Pamphlet on Burke is hilarious. My students are always quite surprised by that.
Yeah.
But she also has really interesting little inset vignettes of kind of narratives or character sketches that carry her argument forward, too.
Yeah, I felt like her humor was unexpected.
And listeners, we mentioned that it might feel overwhelming to sit down and read A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, but that's what's so great about Susan's book is you incorporate a lot of the best bits into your book and explain it.
Well, give it a try. I think pretty much you could read the first two chapters, the introduction in the first two chapters, because she packs everything into there. I mean, readers sometimes complain that this is repetitive, but she's figuring it out for the first time. So, of course, it's repetitive. And she's describing a world wide web. Everything is connected to everything else. And, as soon as you start talking about one thing, you find yourself bringing in something else.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
I mean, that's the power of the repetitiveness is like society needs to kind of have it hammered in over and over. Because if you just see the rationale once, you're like, oh, okay, that's a good point. But as the book builds, by the time you get to the end, you're like, I can't argue with what this woman is saying.
It has that cumulative force. I mean, I'm glad you felt it. I'm not even sure it's a hammering, but it's a kind of relentless education.
Yeah.
She's teaching us how to read. Even the vocabulary of praise. Well, what's wrong with a woman being called innocent, delicate, flower-like? Isn't that the language of love? And she teaches us how to read that not as a language of love, but as an insult wrapped in a language that feels like love, like innocent. She said, this is just a pretty name for ignorance and infancy. And within a chapter, she's calling it imbecility.
That idea of infantilizing even today, like baby doll, like the terms of endearment that women are given sometimes.
Or just don't worry your pretty little head about that.
Yeah.
Some of her chapters seem to be juicier than others, and they may have shocked her readers at the time. We know she wasn't a puritanical person, but it seems like there's a cautionary view of sex in her work. Could you maybe explain her perspective?
Well, 1980s feminists made a great deal about, her being puritanically hysterical about sex. And she's writing this in 1792 before she's ever had sex. And she's only seen bad consequences. Moreover...
Oh, I didn't realize this was before the Imlay and everything.
Yeah, before she meets Imlay in 93.
Okay.
And then Godwin she meets in 95, 96.
Okay.
So, I mean, this is... while she's still a virgin and a very intellectual virgin, and she's seeing only bad consequences of women indulging or being manipulated as sexual beings. Moreover, as Wollstonecraft herself experienced, if you get pregnant out of wedlock as a young woman, you have no social viability. You will never be marriageable. The only option for you is to become a prostitute or to kill yourself. And that was the frequent outcome. So there's a way in which sexual self-discipline is not just prudery, it's a rational assessment of what the severe penalties are for becoming pregnant out of wedlock. So there is that caution. What very comfortable birth control era 1980 feminists, condescend to Wollstonecraft for is something they've never had to contend with themselves. So I think that there's a historical situation for what gets called prudishness, but I would say just rational restraint. The woman who was writing in 1792 really sees female sexuality and men's exploitation of it as part of the tremendous problem of being a woman in the world. She'll call it the wrongs of woman. So I don't want to sort of downplay that she's extraordinarily cautious about this, but there are very good reasons for her caution.
Yeah, it's like a life-saving issue.
Yeah.
Literally life-saving, literally.
Yeah, yeah.
I didn't even get the sense that she was placing a moral judgment other than the practical.
Well, she does have the distance. I mean, boys pigging together, in those boys' schools and girls learning nasty tricks from servants and each other. I mean, there's a kind of lurid softcore porn that is in her head about.
Yeah, for sure. I
Yeah.
mean, I could see people like skip ahead to chapter 8 or
Yeah, yeah.
whatever chapter she's talking about this.
She is worried about that, though, because she doesn't want girls to become too interested in sex at the expense of rational self-control.
Right, right.
All right, so in this work, she so skillfully lays out all of the problems that she sees with society's treatment of women. Does she have any concrete ideas for how to fix things? Does she offer up any solutions?
Well, the solution is the last chapter, if you lasted that long, on national education. She is for free national public co-education. The first site of education is the Republic of Home, where boys and girls, sons and daughters, are treated equally, and where parents regard their children as future citizens and not as subjects merely there to be grateful to their parents and to obey their parents. This was her plan, educating everybody and developing a rational citizenship from this factory of education. But she ends by saying, it's not up to me. The men have the power. They have to start changing the system or put in a fresh order for Russian whips.
Oh, I know. That goes back to one of my favorite lines that she wrote, which is, let woman share the rights, and she will emulate the virtues of man, for she must grow more perfect when emancipated or justify the authority that chains such a weak being to her duty. It's basically like, call my bluff on this.
Yeah.
Give us a chance, and if we cannot rise to the occasion, then we are justified at being held down, and we'll shut up. You can't even argue with that, really. It's saying, give us a chance, and if we don't do it, then you win,
And she knows that that's the key point. The first chapters have a whole bunch of words that begin with preconceived, prejudice, prevailing, prescribed, prescription. That's the world into which we're born. So she wants to remove all those pre-constraints and say, yes, exactly right. You can't say that we are weak, irrational, stupid, and incapable, essentially, when this, in fact, is an effect of the system we live in and not the cause for that system's reinforcement. So you're exactly right. I mean, she's proposing a grand national experiment.
Yeah.
Redo education, educate us, and see if we can share rational responsibility.
Yeah. So gauntlet thrown, and then what was the response to this work when it was published?
Well, two things. It had pretty good reviews in the 1790s. There was one sort of right-wing journal which just wasn't buying it at all, and said that this is just, disrupting the ways of God to man. Next thing we're going to talk about is the rights of children and the rights of animals, and this is a ridiculous slippery slope. But most other reactions were very positive. It's about time. John Adams loved it. Abigail Adams loved it. Aaron Burr loved it, gave it to his daughter. A really interesting American feminist, Judith Sargent Murray, loved it. It went international, and women around the world said, at last, someone has put this together. I've seen this in my classrooms, too. I mean, where women, not U.S. women, but women who attend Princeton from very patriarchal cultures, completely recognize the situation Wollstonecraft was describing. Obviously, they were exceptions, being sent by their parents to Princeton, but this was completely readable to them as, education is the first step. So that was the plan. Everyone thought it was a good idea. What killed it, you mentioned earlier, was Godwin's grieving memoir, in which he reproduced Wollstonecraft as a fallen, corrupt, deviant woman. He didn't mean to, but the enemies jumped on it.
Why do you think I know he wasn't trying to vilify her, he was just trying to tell her story, but her sexual past and everything, why would he have included some of...
That's the big question. Yeah, what was he thinking?
Yeah.
I mean, his philosophical commitment was to candor. But, his best friend said, you stripped your wife naked. How could you do such a thing? And, immediately Wollstonecraft was described as a prostitute, as a whore. The rights of woman was the philosophy of a whore. Her reputation was incinerated immediately and was not recovered for about 100 years.
Wow.
It's like she was canceled.
Yeah.
She was canceled. Her name could not be mentioned in polite society. And it was only when women suffragists were reading her, she was being read sort of underground. She was being read in countries other than England. And they started producing centennial editions of her work. And then Virginia Woolf writes this amazing essay about her. And then Wollstonecraft gets taken up by second wave American and British feminism in the 1970s. But as you can see in my book, there's still a reaction. I mean, there's David Levine's atrocious cartoon of her, the archetypal nasty woman, right?
Yes, yeah.
Really sarcastic reviews of new editions and new lives of Wollstonecraft. Then you have Ferdinand Lundberg and Marina Farnham writing in 1947 that feminism is only the philosophy of bitterness and resentment and female deviance and penis envy. So, history is always uneven progress, but the back and forth about feminist principles is still very much with us.
I mean, there's more of a conversation, at least today, that we're starting to have. But Amy and I talk about this all the time, but it still feels like in some ways we're at the infancy of a feminist movement, even after.
Well, it's a work in progress. There are a lot of setbacks. I mean, I still, I'm 75. Will I ever see a female president?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I hope so. Someday, hopefully, people will be looking back on this time, and it'll be closer than we think to
they'll look at our conversations and say, what were they talking about? We're so past that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But getting back to Mary Wollstonecraft, I still can't say her name, even at the end of the episode. Susan, I knew so shamefully little about her before reading your book. I'm so glad that I now have a better understanding of her life and her work and her impact. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk about it all with us. It's been great.
Well, no, this has really been fun talking to you. I didn't know anything about her when I was an undergraduate because she just simply wasn't on our syllabuses or in our books. That was a kind of act of recovery on my own part, is to learn about her and then just to be amazed. I think Wollstonecraft is a teacher. And that you felt that too. You felt that you were being not just studying something that you should know, but you were actually being taught about how to think.
Yeah.
Love her.
Right.
Love her. So that's all for today's episode. Don't forget to give us a rating and review wherever you listen to this podcast if you enjoy it.
Our theme song was written and recorded by Jenny Malone, and our logo was designed by Harriet Grant. Lost Ladies of Lit is produced by Amy Helms and Kim Askew.